One that was our gracious host last weekend, and we appreciate everything she did. Terry Sewell.
Mr. Speaker, on March 7th, 2015, nearly 100 members of Congress from both sides of the aisle went to Selma to commemorate the 50th anniversary of Bloody Sunday and the 1965 march from Selma to Montgomery. I was humbled to welcome so many of my colleagues in Congress to my hometown of Selma, Alabama. It meant a lot to me and the state of Alabama to also welcome President and Mrs. Obama and their daughters, as well as President and Mrs. George W. Bush to Selma to commemorate the significant events in American history. The Selma movement for voting rights was a uniquely American story of how ordinary Americans working together achieved extraordinary social change. I want to thank all of the members and everyone who participated in the Faith and Politics pilgrimage to Alabama this year. I especially want to thank my Alabama colleagues, Senator Sessions, Representative Martha Roby, Representative Robert Adderholt, Representative Bradley Byrne, and Representative Gary Palmer for their participation in the delegation. A special thanks to Congressman John Lewis and the Faith and Politics Institute for a job well done. You know, Mr. Speaker, the opportunity to walk in the footsteps of John Lewis with John Lewis is an unforgettable experience that is truly transformative. The bipartisan participation by Republicans and Democrats alike was truly something to behold, especially given the hyper-partisanship of Washington. It was something to see us gather together in Selma, Alabama, to honor the sacrifices of the foot soldiers who dared to fight for voter equality 50 years ago. I tried not to have any expectation from this bipartisan showing, but I must admit, my hope was that all of us would be motivated by the experience of traveling with John Lewis in his footsteps with him, to honestly look at modern-day threats to voting rights today. Now that the spotlight is no longer on Selma, we must move beyond the bridge and see that there is still a need to fight to ensure that all Americans can been legitimized in state legislatures across this country. Photo ID laws and efforts nationwide to get rid of early voting or weekend voting are modern efforts that have had profound effect on restricting access to voting. Any effort that restricts or decreases the likelihood of citizens to vote is a threat to the voting ostensibly prevent voter fraud, has had the unintended consequence of making it much harder for certain sectors of the population to vote. My father is a perfect example of an individual who has found it harder to vote because of these modern-day laws. Prior to the state of Alabama imposing a photo ID law to vote, my father, Andrew, a stroke victim who has been wheelchair-bound for the last 10 years, has voted by his validly issued federal ID, a Social Security card, which does not have a photo. But once the law was imposed, my father, who no longer drives, who no longer works, is retired, had no way of getting a photo ID. After the Alabama law changed, my mother and I made sure that my father would get a photo ID to vote. The effort was tremendous. We transported my father in a special wheelchair access van and got him into the old Dallas County Courthouse, which was grandfathered in from having ADA laws and therefore no wheelchair ramp. Once inside the courthouse, the elevator to the registrar's office was being serviced, and we had to wait an hour in order to use it. Once we finally got to the office of the Board of Registrars, there were only one person waiting on 25 people in line. My mother and father persevered. They persevered to make sure that my father got a photo ID that day because he was resolved in voting because his daughter was on the ballot for re-election. But just think of all of the senior citizens or disabled citizens that do not have a relative or person to take them to get a photo ID. This photo requirement definitely reduces the amount and the ability for certain segments of the society to exercise their right to vote. In the Supreme Court ruling which invalidated the preclearance provisions of the VRA, The court said that the formula used by Congress in the covered states was outdated and implied that there was no need for the Voting Rights Act today, since, after all, there was an African American elected to president. Oh, how short-sighted the Supreme Court was. As long as there are vulnerable communities that face barriers to voting, there is still a need for federal protection. Just last year, after the Supreme Court ruling, the city of Evergreen, Alabama, came under federal scrutiny for unfairly excluding African Americans from the voting rolls and for attempting to further dilute their voting power with a redistricting plan that would pack its majority black population into only 2 of the 5 municipal districts. Incidents like Evergreen, Alabama remind us that progress is always elusive, and the injustice suffered on the Edmund Pettus Bridge 50 years ago has not been fully vindicated. Mr. Speaker, beyond the bridge, there is still laws, explicitly or unintended, that limit the access of Americans to vote. Now that we have commemorated the movement that led to the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, what are we going to do to protect the progress that has been made and to expand access for the sacred right to vote? On March 7th, 2015, while en route to Selma, President Obama signed H.R. 431, the bill that awarded a Congressional Gold Medal to the foot soldiers of the Selma to Montgomery March of 1965. Finally, this nation is acknowledging the bravery of these foot soldiers who dared to make this nation live up to its ideals of justice and equality for all. While a great honor, a medal is not adequate repayment for their sacrifice. Mr. Speaker, the greatest tribute that we as members of Congress can give is to work honestly on a bipartisan bill to restore federal voting protections to vulnerable communities in the Voting Rights Act. While I applaud bipartisan efforts made in the Voting Rights Amendment Act of 2015 to create a new formula that would determine which jurisdictions require federal preclearance, this new formula that's in the current VRA Amendment Act omits key states like North Carolina, South Carolina, and Alabama. You know, I can't imagine, Mr. Speaker, that the very state that prompted the Voting Rights Act, Alabama, signed into law 50 years ago, would now not be afforded the protection of federal oversight. The fight for voting rights was born in Alabama, and on my watch, it will not die there. Voting rights advocates and everyday citizens must remain vigilant and do all that they can to safeguard against efforts to constrict democracy in state and local governments. Our democracy requires it. We can all pay a debt of gratitude to those foot soldiers by voting in every election, local, state, and federal. We all have our part to play. And, you know, we in Congress can play a vital role. To echo the President's call to action, President Obama said on that day, "Selma shows us that America is not the project of any one person. The single most powerful word in our democracy is the word we. We, the people, are tasked with strengthening and safeguarding our democracy. We, the people, are responsible for ensuring our nation lives up to its very principles." On the 50th anniversary of the Voting Rights Act and the historic march from Selma to Montgomery, I urge my colleagues, Democrats and Republicans alike, to ourselves to the work that was done by our predecessors, to work together to restore the Voting Rights Act for all Americans. That's the least we can do on this, the 50th anniversary. I look forward to this august body taking up a Voting Rights Amendment Act that fully restores federal protection to all vulnerable communities so that all Americans can definitely exercise that sacred right to vote. Thank you very much. I yield back the balance of my time.